President Trump is at the White House this afternoon for a pair of high-profile sit-downs with the governors of Texas and California. It's unclear exactly what the focus of those separate meetings are. Republican Greg Abbott is, as we know, a staunch supporter of the president, while Democrat Gavin Newsom has been criticized multiple times in the past by President Trump. Today, much of the attention surrounding the president still has to do with what he said about the future of Gaza and the role the United States will allegedly play in its redevelopment.
As far as Gaza is concerned, we'll do what is necessary. If it's necessary, we'll do that. We're going to take over that piece, we're going to develop it, create thousands and thousands of jobs, and it'll be something that the entire Middle East can be very proud of.
CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe joins us now. So, Ed, a lot of shockwaves after those comments, but is it still just shock value, or have we gotten any more specifics from the White House?
Not many more, Lindsay. The White House press secretary in the last hour saying that essentially the idea or the concept of putting U.S. troops in Gaza as part of a, quote, takeover has not been committed to yet, but she also wouldn't remove that possibility from the list of options. The discussion by the president last night about the future of Gaza comes as he has a series of meetings in the coming days with leaders from that part of the world or with leaders who have interests in that part of the world. You have the King of Jordan coming in the coming days. You have Vice President Vance headed to a series of meetings in Europe, where, of course, the situation in the Middle East remains a big concern. The Prime Minister of Japan is coming to Washington, and we may hear about other meetings that he's having. But it seems broadly that what the president's trying to do is, of course, see the end of hostilities between Israel and Hamas, and then sort out how exactly 2 million plus Gazans continue to live in the Strip there. The press secretary is suggesting that the president is trying to put bold, out-of-the-box ideas on the table to try to get some kind of resolution.
The president has said before this is their war. So do we know why then he is suggesting sending American troops to Gaza for this?
That's what's so confusing and unsettling about it to some, on top of just the idea that you would displace 2 million people permanently. Notable today, the press secretary suggested that they would be temporarily relocated while the Strip was redeveloped and then be allowed to come back. But that, of course, raises all sorts of questions about where would they go temporarily, what would happen when they came back, are you building it for them for free, would they have to pay you for it, who's building it, who's protecting it all, and oh, by the way, is the actual conflict between Israel and Hamas going to end anytime soon, which is set to be part of the next phase of the ceasefire plan that's been put in place that is leading to the release of hostages. We didn't get any of those answers today. We'll see if we do in the coming days. But either way, he's raised the issue now. It has caught the attention of the world, and the Trump administration anticipates it'll lead to further conversation about what exactly to do.
This brings me to my next question. Is anyone tied to the administration showing any concerns privately about the ripple effect that these comments could have for the future of the ceasefire deal?
You know, we haven't heard of anything publicly, although it was interesting that Steve Witkoff, who is the president's lead negotiator for that region and was involved in putting the ceasefire plan in place, just yesterday had suggested that the deal, as currently being played out, quote, wasn't so wonderful, and that the Trump administration, quote, had, quote, nothing to do with it. But that, of course, the president is continuing to take credit for it. So whether or not they're going to continue with it into the next several phases, or whether they've got to start again, remains to be seen, and was likely subject to some of the conversations that went on last night with the Israeli leader. The other thing we're monitoring for, as can sometimes happen after statements like this, is what kind of reaction do we see not only in the Middle East itself, but around the world, and could there be any other security fallout for suggesting this kind of thing, given how bold the president was in suggesting that there should be a permanent resettlement of that region, even though today they're saying temporarily relocated.
Obviously, yeah, this is dominating a lot of headlines, but the administration is working fast and furious to unveil policies and proposals. For example, we know nearly all of the staff for USAID will be put on leave on Friday. We're also hearing the CIA is offering buyouts for nearly all of its employees to align with the president's priorities. What is the White House saying about these efforts?
Well, and not all CIA employees, but at least those that aren't dealing with critical national security issues. Okay. So we don't know specifically if that means like folks in accounting and HR at the CIA, or if it means folks on the, Afghanistan desk. There's just no clear detail on that quite yet. But we know that there is some kind of reduction in force being attempted over at the CIA, as there is across much of the federal government, as is something that he campaigned on doing, right? Reducing the size and scope of the federal government, handing some responsibilities back to the states, cutting redundancies. That's part of what Elon Musk and his team are up to. It is certainly disruptive and confusing and quite concerning for those that are accepting federal aid, whether it's here in the United States or around the world, that is now up for review. But this is all part of a plan that they had said would be attempted, and that continues to play out. And we should also point out what the president said himself, that Musk is coming up with these ideas. He says that Musk is bringing them to him. They have some discussions about how exactly to proceed, and then he proceeds. The big question going forward in the next few days, certainly for a lot of people here in Washington and in any other federal government office, of which there are thousands across the country, is will they indeed move forward with potential either layoffs or the implementation of buyouts? How many federal employees took those buyouts? There are some reports of just 5 figures so far, nothing confirmed yet. The administration has said they'll let us know how many, but we'll see if they do. And if they don't hit their targets, which we believe to have been in the 6 figures, would they then try to start reducing workforce in some other way? The one early step we anticipate is in at least some agencies looking at the probationary period workers, those that maybe were only hired in the last 3 months or 6 months, or in some cases probationary periods last up to 2 years. Do you go to that group and say, well, of all those people, we can get rid of this many or all of them or some of them and help reduce headcount that way? Either way, it looks like many of these agencies are heading in that direction in the coming weeks.
Ed O'Keefe, thank you.